It began on a spring night in New York City, April 19, 1989. The air was crisp, the kind of night when the city feels alive with possibility. Central Park, that vast green heart of Manhattan, was still bustling as darkness fell. Joggers, couples, kids, and friends filled its winding paths. The park had always been a sanctuary, but that night, it became the stage for one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in American history. 5 boys, teenagers from Harlem, Corey Wise, Antron McCray, Yusef Salaam, Kevin Richardson, and Raymond Santana, would leave their homes that evening without knowing their lives were about to be stolen. They were just kids, 14, 15, and 16 years old. Kids who laughed at jokes, argued with parents, dreamed about the future. Kids who loved basketball, hip-hop, and hanging out with friends. Kids who were no different from any others in the city. But to a system already stacked against them, they were never seen as children. They were Black and Latino boys. And that was enough. That same night, a young white woman named Tricia Mailey went for a jog through the park. She was a 28-year-old investment banker, driven and athletic. Hours later, she would be found brutally beaten, raped, and left for dead in a ravine. Her injuries were catastrophic, a fractured skull, broken bones, and loss of nearly 80% of her blood. She was in a coma for 12 days, and doctors doubted she would survive. The city was horrified, enraged. And the pressure on police to find someone, anyone, to blame, exploded. In the days that followed, the NYPD would round up more than 30 kids from Harlem. Among them, Corey, Antron, Yusef, Kevin, and Raymond. They were arrested, questioned, and accused. They had no idea what they were walking into. Each boy thought it was just a misunderstanding, that they'd explain themselves and go home. But instead, they were thrust into a nightmare. Inside the precinct, detectives used every trick in the book, and every abuse of power they could get away with. The boys were interrogated for hours, some for more than 24 hours straight. No food, no water, no rest. No parents in the room, no lawyers to protect them. Just teenagers, exhausted and terrified, trapped under the gaze of seasoned detectives who had already decided they were guilty. The boys were told lies, your friend already gave you up. If you just confess, you can go home. They were yelled at, threatened, and manipulated until their young minds broke under the pressure. And then, one by one, they confessed. Not because they were guilty, but because they were desperate to escape. Their stories were inconsistent, filled with holes, contradicting one another. But it didn't matter. To the police, the case was closed. They had their suspects. The media pounced. Headlines screamed about a wolf pack of teenagers roaming Central Park, hunting for victims. They were painted as animals, predators, monsters. The boys' faces and names were plastered across newspapers before they ever saw a courtroom. In a city gripped by fear and racial tension, the narrative was sealed, these boys were guilty. What happened next would define not just their lives, but the lives of their families, their communities, and the city itself. Trials were set. Juries convened. Prosecutors sharpened their arguments. The truth didn't matter, conviction did. And the boys, barely old enough to drive, would face the full weight of a system built to destroy them. As the courtroom doors opened, the Central Park Five entered a stage they never asked to walk. Shackled not just by handcuffs, but by the lies told about them, the prejudice against them, and the power of a city determined to see them punished. This is their story. The precinct walls were cold, painted in dull colors that seemed to close in on the boys. The hours dragged on, but to them, it felt endless. Kevin Richardson sat in a hard chair, his head heavy from fatigue. He was only 14 years old. 14. He should have been home, asleep in bed, with his school books scattered on the floor. Instead, He was staring at detectives who towered over him, voices sharp, faces hardened. "Your friends already told us what you did," one detective snapped. "You better tell us your side." Kevin shook his head. He didn't understand. He hadn't done anything. He had been in the park, yes, with a group of kids. But he didn't attack anyone. How could he explain that when every time he tried to speak, the detectives interrupted? They shoved photos in front of him, crime scene pictures, blood, grass trampled in the dark. "This is on you," they said. Hours passed. The clock ticked, but to Kevin, it meant nothing. No food. No rest. His mother wasn't there, though he begged for her. Instead, it was just him, a scared child, cornered by men with badges and notebooks. And finally, when his voice cracked from exhaustion, he broke. "Fine," he whispered. "I'll say it. I was there." The detectives leaned in, satisfied. They didn't care about the truth. They cared about closing the case. In another room, Raymond Santana, just 14 as well, was crumbling under the same pressure. His father had been called, but when he arrived, he didn't understand the danger. He thought if his son just talked, just explained himself, he'd be able to go home. The detectives promised as much. "Just let him tell us what happened," they said. "Then you can both leave." But it was a lie. Raymond's voice was shaky. He stumbled over details, mixing up times and places. The story he told didn't match the evidence, didn't match Kevin's, didn't match anyone's. Yet the detectives encouraged him. "Good," they said. "Keep going." They scribbled notes, feeding him lines, pushing him to repeat phrases. They were writing a script, and Raymond was just the frightened actor. Yusef Salam, 15 years old, sat in another chair, silent. He refused to confess, refused to play their game. But that didn't protect him. They still twisted his presence into guilt. They claimed he was part of it, whether he spoke or not. And when his mother arrived, a fierce woman who saw through the lies, she demanded her son's release. "You're not questioning him without me," she said, her voice sharp as steel. Eventually, she managed to get Yusef out. But the damage was already done, his name was tied to the case. Antron McCrae, 15, sat in yet another room, tears in his eyes. His father, Bobby, had come to the station. Bobby was tough, a man who had lived his whole life under the weight of discrimination and survival. He thought he was protecting his son when he told him to do what the detectives asked. "Just tell them what they want to hear," Bobby whispered. "Then you can come home." Antron looked at his father, the man he trusted more than anyone. And against his own instincts, he obeyed. The words spilled out. A false confession, fed by detectives, guided by fear. Later, Antron would say that moment shattered him. Not just the confession, but the betrayal he felt when his father told him to speak. A wound that would never fully heal. And then there was Corey Wise. 16 years old, the oldest of the group. Corey wasn't even on the original list of kids picked up that night. He had only gone down to the precinct to support his friend Yusef. But once he was inside, the detectives turned their attention to him. And Corey, who had hearing difficulties and a learning disability, became the easiest target of all. For hours they grilled him, tore him down, broke him. No parent was present. No lawyer advised him. Just Corey, alone in a room filled with authority and accusation. And finally, exhausted beyond measure, he confessed. His story, too, made little sense. But to the police, the details didn't matter. They had what they wanted, videotaped confessions. Evidence for the jury. Proof for the headlines. The tapes are haunting to watch even today. Boys with soft voices, stumbling over words, describing events they clearly didn't understand. Some placed themselves at the scene while others said they held the victim down, but none of it matched the physical evidence. None of it matched reality. But the cameras rolled, and the prosecutors smiled. They had their case. The city erupted. The newspapers screamed, "Wolf Pack in Central Park." The language was savage, animalistic. These boys were not described as children, but as predators. Politicians seized the moment, demanding harsher laws, tougher sentences. A full-page newspaper ad, funded by a powerful real estate developer named Donald Trump, called for the reinstatement of the death penalty. "Bring back the death penalty. Bring back our police," the ad read. It was a rallying cry, and the city listened. Public opinion was poisoned. These 5 boys, who should have been presumed innocent, were already condemned in the eyes of millions. Their neighbors looked at them with suspicion. Their schools, their communities, their friends, everything changed overnight. Their faces were stamped with guilt before a jury ever heard their names. The trials began in 1990. Courtrooms filled with spectators, reporters, and families. The prosecutors laid out their case, weaving a story of violence and rage. They played the videotaped confessions, ignoring the contradictions, ignoring the lack of physical evidence, ignoring the fact that DNA found at the crime scene didn't match any of the boys. They presented a narrative, not facts. And the jury believed it. Kevin Richardson, 14 years old, was convicted of attempted murder, rape, sodomy, and robbery. He was sentenced to 5 to 10 years. Antron McCray, 15, was convicted of rape, sodomy, and assault. He was sentenced to 5 to 10 years. Yusef Salam, 15, was convicted of sexual abuse, assault, and attempted murder. He was sentenced to 5 to 10 years. Raymond Santana, 14, was convicted of rape and assault. He was sentenced to 5 to 10 years. And Corey Wise, 16, tried as an adult, was convicted of sexual abuse, assault, and riot. He was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in an adult prison. The verdicts crushed their families. Mothers wept in courtrooms. Fathers buried their faces in their hands. The boys themselves sat in silence, stunned, too young to fully grasp what had just happened. They had been children yesterday. Today, they were convicts. Prison swallowed them. For the younger boys, juvenile facilities became their new world. Bars, guards, strict routines. They learned quickly how to survive, when to fight, when to stay silent, when to disappear. Each carried the weight of shame, not because they had done anything wrong, but because the world believed they had. Corey's journey was the harshest. Sent to Rikers Island at 16, he entered a brutal adult prison system where violence was constant. He endured beatings, isolation, and years of solitary confinement. Corey later said he spent much of his time talking to himself in his cell, creating conversations in his mind to keep from going insane. He became invisible, forgotten by a world that never cared for him to begin with. And yet, through it all, each boy clung to fragments of hope. Letters from family, rare visits, small moments of humanity. They dreamed of freedom, of clearing their names, of one day walking back into the sun as themselves again. But the years dragged on. Seasons changed. Childhoods were erased. And the Central Park 5 became symbols of guilt in the eyes of a city that had moved on. What they did not know, what no one knew at the time, was that the truth was still out there. The real attacker still walked free. And one day, years later, he would step forward, and everything would change. Prison. For children, it was the end of childhood. For the Central Park 5, it was the beginning of something darker. The verdicts sent shockwaves through their families. Mothers collapsed in courtrooms, fathers hung their heads in silence, siblings cried in confusion. Each boy, just a teenager, was swallowed by a machine built to grind men down. And now, it was pointed squarely at them. Raymond Santana, only 14 when arrested, entered the prison system carrying fear heavier than his own body weight. The steel doors clanged shut behind him, sealing off freedom. The noise, the shouting, the smell of sweat and despair, it was another universe. Guards barked orders. Inmates eyed him like prey. He was no longer a boy, he was a number. Kevin Richardson, barely 15, had to learn fast that weakness could cost you your life. He tried to keep his head down, but prison is not a place that lets you hide. Fights erupted. Every day was a test of survival. Every night was haunted by the memory of his mother's face, pressed against the glass during visits, promising him he would come home, even as the years stretched endlessly. Antron McCray felt betrayed, not just by the police, not just by the prosecutors, but by his own father. During the interrogations, his father had urged him to cooperate, to say what the detectives wanted. His father believed it would protect him. But it had sealed his fate. That wound, deeper than prison walls, stayed with him, festering. In his cell, Antron replayed that night over and over. His anger became armor, but it also became poison. Yusef Salaam tried to cling to his faith. He prayed. He read. He searched for meaning in a world that had stripped him of innocence. Letters from his mother became lifelines. Her words reminded him that he was more than the numbers stitched on his uniform, more than the bars that caged him. Yet even faith trembled under the weight of isolation, the constant reminder that society had branded him guilty. But no one bore the heaviest burden like Corey Wise. Unlike the others, Corey was 16, tried as an adult. His sentence sent him not to a juvenile facility, but to Rikers Island and then to some of the harshest adult prisons in New York State. He was still a child, but the system threw him to the wolves. Corey's years inside were brutal. Beatings, stabbings, solitary confinement, survival was a daily negotiation. He spent years in the box, a cell the size of a bathroom, alone 23 hours a day. The silence drove men mad. The darkness pressed in. Corey held on to sanity by escaping into his imagination. He dreamed of walking free, of hearing music on the streets, of sitting down to a meal that wasn't a tray of slop. He dreamed, because without dreams, there was nothing left. The boys grew into men behind bars. Birthdays passed. Holidays came and went. The world outside changed, music, fashion, politics, but inside, time stood still. When visits came, mothers pressed their hands against thick glass, their eyes watering, their voices shaking. They brought news from Harlem, updates on cousins, neighbors, the block. But as the years dragged on, even visits slowed. Some family members passed away. Some friends moved on. The boys were forgotten by a city that had never truly seen them. Still, they endured. Because they had no choice. Because somewhere deep inside, they knew they were innocent. And that truth burned like a flame no prison wall could snuff out. But the years were merciless. By the late 1990s, each of them had served nearly their full sentences. They were men now, carrying the scars of youth stolen. One by one, they were released back into a world that still looked at them with suspicion. Their names were not cleared. Their records still bore the weight of rapist, felon, Central Park 5. Freedom, when it came, was not freedom at all. Finding jobs was nearly impossible. Employers saw their records and turned them away. Housing was denied. Old friends avoided them. The stigma followed them everywhere. They were out of prison, but the cage had only changed shape. And yet, their nightmare was not finished. The truth had not yet been revealed. The real perpetrator still walked free. And the world still believed the lie. The truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface, no matter how deeply it's buried. For the Central Park Five, now grown men carrying the scars of stolen youth, the truth came from an unexpected place, a convicted murderer and rapist named Matias Reyes. It was the early 2000s. Corey Wise was serving his time at Auburn Correctional Facility when fate intervened. Within the same prison walls lived Matias Reyes, a man already convicted of multiple rapes and a brutal murder. Reyes had nothing to gain, no plea deals to chase, no freedom waiting for him. He was serving a life sentence. And yet, one day, he approached authorities with a confession. "I did it," Reyes said. "The jogger in Central Park. That was me. And me alone." At first, his words sounded impossible. After all, the city had long convinced itself that 5 boys were responsible. But Reyes was relentless. He described details of the crime scene that only the perpetrator could know. He spoke with chilling clarity about the attack on Trisha Meili, about dragging her into the ravine, about the violence he inflicted that nearly killed her. The NYPD resisted. Prosecutors resisted. After all, admitting Reyes was guilty meant admitting the city had been wrong, catastrophically wrong. But then came the science. DNA evidence, tested with advancements unavailable in 1989, proved it beyond a shadow of doubt. The semen found on the victim matched only one man, Matias Reyes. Not Corey. Not Antron. Not Yusef. Not Kevin. Not Raymond. Reyes, and Reyes alone. The weight of that revelation shattered what little justification remained. In 2002, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office officially vacated the convictions of the Central Park Five. After more than a decade of imprisonment, humiliation, and exile, their names were cleared. The moment of exoneration was bittersweet. Families cried. The men embraced, some too stunned to even speak. Freedom had always been a word hanging in the air, but now it had shape, weight, reality. And yet, nothing could return the lost years. Nothing could restore the childhoods that were stolen, the birthdays missed, the mothers buried while sons sat in cells. Nothing could erase the scars. The public reaction was explosive. Where once headlines had screamed, "Wolf Pack," now newspapers admitted a colossal injustice. The same city that branded them animals was now forced to look them in the eye as men who had endured the unendurable. Donald Trump, who in 1989 had taken out full-page ads calling for their execution, never apologized. Many others never did, either. But the truth was out. And truth, once revealed, cannot be caged. The 5 men, now known as the Exonerated Five, walked into a new chapter of their lives. They became symbols, not just of injustice, but of resilience. They began to speak publicly, to tell their story, to reclaim their voices. For years, they had been silenced. Now, they were determined to be heard. Raymond Santana spoke of the endless nights replaying his interrogation, the trauma that never left him. Kevin Richardson described how hard it was to explain to his daughters why the world once called him a monster. Antron McCray, quieter, more reserved, carried his pain in silence, rarely speaking publicly. Yusef Salaam turned to faith and activism, becoming a voice of power and healing in his community. And Corey Wise, the one who had endured the longest and harshest years, often let his presence alone tell the story, a living testament to survival against impossible odds. Their fight was not over. In 2003, the men filed a civil rights lawsuit against New York City, demanding accountability for what had been done to them. The legal battle dragged on for over a decade, as the city resisted paying damages. Finally, in 2014, the city settled for $41 million, roughly $1 million for each year each man had lost. But to the men, the money was never the point. No amount could replace their stolen youth. The settlement was simply recognition of what they had endured, a public acknowledgement that the city had been wrong. In the years that followed, their story became a rallying cry. Books were written. Documentaries filmed. And in 2019, Ava DuVernay's Netflix series When They See Us brought their nightmare to millions of viewers worldwide, sparking outrage, heartbreak, and a renewed demand for justice reform. The Exonerated Five became cultural icons, standing not just for themselves, but for every innocent person trapped in a system that too often fails the most vulnerable. Today, each of them continues to live with the scars, but also with purpose. They speak at schools, community centers, universities. They tell young people, do not let the system define you. They tell policymakers, change is not optional, it is urgent. And they tell the world, never forget what was done to us, because it is still happening to others. Their story ends not in defeat, but in resilience. They were boys when the system tried to crush them. They are men now, and their voices are louder than the lies that once condemned them. And for us, the listeners, the watchers, the citizens, their story is not just history. It is a mirror, reflecting the flaws in our justice system, the dangers of racial prejudice, the consequences of fear-driven justice. The Exonerated Five remind us of a truth too often forgotten. Justice is not a gift, it is a fight. And that fight is far from over. Exoneration was not the end. It was the beginning of something larger. For years, the Exonerated Five had lived under the weight of a lie. Now, freed from its chains, they carried the truth into the world like a torch. Their story was not just their own, it belonged to every mother who feared for her son walking home, every father who knew the law might not protect him, every young person of color who understood that innocence alone was never enough. In Harlem, in classrooms across New York, the five men became living lessons. Children listened wide-eyed as they described how the system had stolen their youth. Teachers invited them not just to recount their suffering, but to speak of resilience, of hope, of fighting back when the world tries to silence you. Each man became a messenger, not polished politicians, but survivors whose pain gave their words power. Yusef Salaam, once a 15-year-old boy branded a predator, now stood before audiences as a poet, an activist, a candidate for public office. He told his story with the rhythm of scripture, blending faith and fire. We were made to be examples, not of guilt, but of strength. Korey Wise, soft-spoken, scarred by solitary, carried an aura of quiet gravity. When he walked into a room, silence followed. He didn't need many words. His survival was testimony enough. Donations he made helped fund the Innocence Project and the Korey Wise Innocence Initiative, his way of making sure others would not endure what he had. Kevin Richardson, once just a kid with dreams of playing the trumpet, spoke openly about the nightmares that haunted him still. But he also told of his determination to be present for his children, to show them that brokenness does not define a man. Raymond Santana, who once walked out of prison into a world that rejected him, built businesses, art, and advocacy. He showed young people that even after society brands you, you can rebrand yourself, not as what they called you, but as who you truly are. And Antron McCray, quieter than the rest, often reluctant to revisit the pain, stood as a reminder that not all scars heal in public. His silence was its own kind of testimony, proof that even when words fail, the truth of injustice cannot be erased. Their collective story shook America. It forced difficult questions into living rooms, into courtrooms, into city halls. How many others sat in cells for crimes they did not commit? How many confessions were wrung out of terrified children, desperate to go home? How many prosecutors built careers on shattered lives? The Exonerated Five reminded America of a fact too often ignored: justice is not colorblind. It sees skin. It sees poverty. It sees vulnerability. And it too often punishes those who already carry the heaviest burdens. In 2019, millions watched When They See Us. For some, it was the first time hearing their story. For others, it was a reopening of old wounds. A Across the nation, viewers wept, raged, and demanded change. Strangers approached the five men on the street to apologize, not because they were personally guilty, but because America was. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of the exonerated five is this: they did not allow their suffering to end in silence. They refused to disappear into bitterness. They turned pain into purpose. They transformed their stolen years into fuel for change. Their voices echo still, in classrooms, in city councils, in protests, in the quiet determination of mothers who teach their children how to survive a world that still sees them as threats. Their story did not end with their exoneration, it lives on, reminding us of what is broken, and what can be rebuilt. And now, it lives with you, the listener. Because remembering is not enough. Sharing is not enough. Action is the legacy the exonerated five leave behind. Action against wrongful convictions. Action against racial profiling. Action against the silence that allows injustice to repeat itself. They were children once, stripped of innocence, branded as monsters. But today, they stand as men, as fathers, as voices, as proof that truth endures even after decades of lies. This is not just their story. This is America's story. And how we tell it, how we remember it, will shape what kind of nation we become. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine. Imagine being 14 years old, running down the block to meet friends, full of energy, full of dreams. Imagine being 15, worried about school, about sneakers, about your first crush. Imagine being 16, just stepping into the world, thinking you have time to figure out who you are. Now imagine being ripped from that life, police lights flashing, cold cuffs biting into your wrists, the sound of doors locking behind you. Imagine adults screaming at you, calling you liar, calling you animal, breaking you down until you repeat the words they feed you. Imagine confessing to something you never did, because you think it will let you go home, but instead, it locks you away for years. This was the reality for Corey, Antron, Yusef, Kevin, and Raymond. Children. Labeled as predators, branded guilty before they could even speak for themselves. Their mothers carried photographs into courtrooms, showing baby faces with birthday hats, first days of school, Sunday mornings in church. These are our sons, they wanted to scream. These are children, not monsters. But their voices were drowned out by headlines, by prosecutors hungry for a win, by a city that demanded blood. Every birthday behind bars was a stolen year. Every Christmas, every family dinner, every laugh with friends, gone. Instead, they had steel doors, concrete floors, and a justice system that refused to admit its own mistake. And yet, through all of it, they endured. Corey Wise spent birthdays in solitary confinement, but he imagined cake and candles in his mind. Yusef Salam read scriptures and poetry, speaking light into the darkness of his cell. Raymond Santana sketched, filling blank pages with drawings of the freedom he longed for. Kevin Richardson helped type in the image of his mother's face during visits, her hand pressed against glass. Antron McCray carried his pain in silence, finding strength in simply surviving another day. These boys, now men, emerged from their cages carrying invisible scars. Nightmares, flashbacks, mistrust of a world that betrayed them. And yet, they walked forward. Because survival, for them, was an act of resistance. Speaking their truth was an act of rebellion. Living their lives fully, despite all that was taken, was the greatest justice of all. Their story forces us to look in the mirror. It asks America, who do we see when we look at Black and Latino children? Do we see their humanity? Their potential? Or do we see danger, suspicion, threat? The Central Park Five remind us of a brutal truth: it is easy to dehumanize when fear and prejudice lead the way. It is harder, but necessary, to see the child behind the headlines, the humanity behind the handcuffs. And in remembering their story, we are are called to act. Because they are not alone. Across the country, countless others sit in cells for crimes they did not commit. Their voices are unheard. Their names are unknown. Their childhoods are being stolen as we speak. The Exonerated 5 story is not just about the past. It is a warning about the present. And it is a demand for the future. 30 years. 30 years stolen. 5 children entered the system as suspects. They walked out as survivors. And today, they stand as symbols, not of guilt, not of shame, but of the unbreakable power of truth. Korey Wise, Antron McCray, Yusef Salaam, Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana. The Exonerated 5. Their story is more than tragedy. It is testimony. A testimony of how fragile justice can be when driven by fear and prejudice. A testimony of how power, when unchecked, can devastate lives. And a testimony of how resilience, the kind born in the darkest of places, can outlast even the most brutal injustice. But their story is also unfinished. Because tonight, as you listen, there are more Raymonds, more Kevins, more Yusefs, more Antrons, more Koreys, sitting in cells, waiting for someone to believe them, waiting for someone to speak their names. That's where you come in. If you believe justice matters, if you believe no child should ever lose their future to lies, if you believe truth deserves to be louder than fear, then do something simple, but powerful. Share this story. Let the world hear it. Like this video, so it rises above the noise. And subscribe, because together, we will keep telling the stories that demand to be heard. Every click, every share, every voice makes their fight louder. And somewhere out there, another innocent soul may one day walk free because you chose to care. This is not just history. This is a movement. The Exonerated 5 endured for all of us. Now, it's our turn to carry their voices forward. Because when they see us, truly see us, that is when change begins.